Welcome back to Primetime News.
And a special welcome once again to our viewers on onespotmedia.com.
Up first this evening, human rights group Jamaicans for Justice is bashing the government's proposal for convicted murderers to serve a minimum of 30 years in prison.
Prime Minister Andrew Holness made the proposal late last evening as the House extended the states of public emergency. Andrea Chisholm has the details.
There have been 1,363 reported murders in Jamaica from January 1 to November 16. That's an increase of almost 6% over the same period in 2021. To help bring the murder rate under control, this proposal from the Prime Minister.
We have to look at the offense of murder, and we have to increase that penalty. And Madam Speaker, my thoughts on the matter, though not yet finalized, but the thinking is that we should give 30 years minimum for murder. Early next year, we will be coming to the House with amendments to the penalty for murder.
The Justice Minister has already been instructed to bring the proposed legislative change. Executive Director of Jamaicans for Justice, Michael Jackson, is already taking issue with the plan.
When you put an absolute criteria that the courts or the judge must stand by, you're taking away the judicial discretion that is provided for to the court to really be looking at the unique circumstances of each case that is brought before the court. So, for example, when you have murders or any other crime that is committed by a youngster who may have been forced or whatever the other circumstances may be, you're taking away that judicial discretion. And we see it with the firearms legislation that was recently passed, and that was a criticism that JFJ offered.
Illegal possession of firearm and ammunition now has a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in prison. Speaking of prisons, Ms. Jackson described some of the conditions in Jamaica as inhumane.
I must remind persons that our prison system right now, it is fraught with a lot of challenges. You're talking about inhumane conditions. We need more prisons to be built in Jamaica that respond to certain international standards, and that is not what we have now. So if the prison system faces that many challenges with dilapidated buildings, lack of rehabilitation and reform, when you put in mandatory minimums, what could you possibly be adding to? I want to also add that Jamaica's murder definition, if you will, the offense, it's either murder or capital murder. We do not have, like in the United States, that deals with second-degree murder where you can have a lesser sentence.
In the meantime, Mr. Holness says the Fingerprint Act will be reviewed to account for new technology.
And this will be done to expand powers to the courts to order the taking of fingerprints and photographs for several offenses which were not covered under the old Fingerprint Act, to expand the offenses schedule, to expand the groups authorized to take fingerprints, to extend the time for the retention of fingerprints, and to provide for the use of approved modern technology for electronic taking of the fingerprint and for the storage of the data.
Come next year, a joint select committee of Parliament will also begin to examine the new Bail Act. Andrea Chisholm, TVJ News.
And still in Parliament, all eyes will be on Friday's sitting of the Senate to see if at least one opposition member will support the extension of the SOE until January 14 next year. The government had to use its majority in the House of Representatives to get the required two-thirds majority vote because the opposition refused to support the measure. Now, opposition leader Mark Golding continues to argue about the constitutionality of SOEs on a long-term basis. He cited two court rulings that have questioned the use of SOEs since 2017.
So, as it stands today, the courts have cast doubt on the constitutionality of the government's use of the SOE procedure. And in that context, it is, in my view, highly inappropriate and a disregard for the cardinal constitutional principle of respecting the separation of powers among the three branches of the state, the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive, for the government to be continuing to use the SOE procedure in this way.
He adds that despite concerns from the opposition, they did not receive the SOE regulations until November 17. That's 2 days after the SOEs were declared.
It means that for 2 days, while the SOEs were in force, persons were being subject to detention. There was no legal regime in place to govern the powers being exercised by the security forces. And there was no SOE tribunal in place either. In fact, the areas within the SOEs were in a legal vacuum for those 2 days. Furthermore, the SOE regulations and the SOE tribunals were finalized and gazetted with no consultation or input from the opposition, despite the fact that the earlier draft had been critiqued by the opposition